Hello, and welcome to this edition of Spirit RX Podcast, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Healing. I'm Dr. Luke, Quantum Chiropractor, and this is Dr. Michael, Naturopath Extraordinaire. We love to integrate best practices of modern medicine with ancient remedies and modalities. In this podcast, we'll explore contemporary health and wellness topics with a blend of wisdom, humor, and practical tips for the everyday person. If you want to learn more about our stories, our businesses, how to connect with us, please click on the video links below.
Welcome. So today we are talking about old medicines. So things that we used to use in the past that we don't use anymore. So quackery at its finest is
Right.
what we're focusing on today. So you told me a really, really interesting story recently, and I think that's what we should start
Yeah.
with that.
So I love when I hear a phrase that people use in common everyday language, and then I wonder what's the origin or the story or the history behind that phrase? How did that come into our language? And there's several phrases like that that have a direct root association with some medical practices. So the first one, the other day I heard someone mention the idea of like, don't blow smoke up my butt. And it's like, oh, blow smoke up your butt. I wonder where that came from. That's weird, right?
Is
Like
the
what,
first person to say that.
literally, what is that? So, anyway, I dug into the history of that. It's pretty fascinating. So, in the 18th century, so this would be the mid 1700s, the idea of smoke, especially tobacco smoke, was coming more into popular lore, probably especially in Britain as we started to have connections with Native Americans and we began to learn some things that they were doing. And they used tobacco a lot for many things in their ceremony and their medicine. So, anyway, that idea of tobacco smoke came back into England. And so, this idea of blowing smoke at people, on people, maybe even a smoke enema, those were ideas that were being floated around at the time. So the story goes 1748, some people were by a waterway and a woman was nearly drowned and they drug her out onto the bank and she appears to be dead. And at that time there wasn't a lot of ideas about how could you resuscitate a drowning victim. The crowd gathered and then people began making suggestions. What about this? What about this? What about this? So someone suggested, well, tobacco smoke enema might do the trick. And so now it's like, can you imagine being in that circle and they're like, yeah, let's okay, who's going to do that? Right? So they talked the husband of the nearly drowned woman, said, you do it. So somebody had a pipe and they had tobacco in there and they let the man insert that, the end of the pipe into the woman's rectum, blew into the end of it and probably smoke, but maybe even some hot embers were blown into her rectum area. And all of a sudden she jumps up and resuscitates. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, it's a miracle. This is amazing. This tobacco smoke enema, this is amazing. How do we not? We got to promote this. Anyway, so that began to be a pretty popular thing, especially in the news at the time, and a bunch of different organizations grew up around it. As a matter of fact, they even for a short while, in first aid kits that were along waterways, they had to have a hose and a bellows and tobacco because that was thought to be a cure for drowning victims. Today, I don't think we would say that that would be our first choice of remedy. But so when you hear that phrase, oh, someone's just blowing smoke up my rear, my butt, whatever, that's where the origin of that comes from. So today it just means someone's doing something that's not going to matter. They're telling you something just to tickle your ears that isn't really true. So it's a false remedy that turned into kind of this common saying today.
Yeah, and I think, a couple things just to talk about with this, because I think there's some interesting facts that kind of go along with it. So, if you think back to that time period, it wasn't common for people to go directly to venous access. Like, no one was carrying around needles. Like, needles weren't
Right,
really necessarily mass
right.
produced in that way. And so, you got to think, like, okay, if you wanted to get some sort of nutrient, some sort of, medicine into the body, you either did it through like the airway,
Yep.
right? Or you did it through the rectum. Because believe it or not, there is a direct venous kind of system. You can bypass the liver and get directly into the bloodstream through the rectum. So there is an aspect to that
That made sense in the
aspect,
moment.
a essence.
Well, when you said
So,
Venus, I first was thinking like, are you talking astrology now? The planet Venus? Oh no, wait, okay, hold on.
no, no,
Venus in the
Venus,
vein.
vein,
Okay,
yeah.
I'm with you.
So basically, I guess what I'm making a point about with this is that there were logical inferences that were made that were
Right.
not correct, but I think that it made sense that they were able to think, okay, how can we get this medicine directly into the body to stimulate a response? I think that was the thought process.
Right.
I hope that was the thought process. It's a very odd therapy. So that being said, another phrase that we
Okay.
commonly hear is brand spanking new.
Right.
Brand spanking new. Where does that come from? So first off, you have the brand aspect of it.
Okay.
We've all heard this before, right? You say, "Oh, that's brand spanking new." Who was the first person that decided to throw a spanking into that comment? Like, what does that even mean? Brand is pretty straightforward. Like we have lots of brands of different things that we can
Right.
think of, right? You have Nike, you have
Sure.
Chick-fil-A, whatever. You got a brand that goes with that. Well, that goes back to when they used to actually brand cattle, people at one time. It was a signal of ownership, and they had typically a mark of some kind that correlated with their ownership. And so that was branding. So when something was brand spanking new, that's actually referring to a baby. When they first came out, there was the practice of spanking the baby to revitalize them. And that has since fallen out of practice. But it wasn't that long ago that they were spanking babies when they first came out.
Well, I bet I was spanked when I came out of the womb.
So the baby was brand spanking new, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but I think it's interesting. Was there a time where people were putting their mark on children? I don't know about that. I'd have to research that a little bit, but that's where that kind of comes
Right.
from, that whole phrase, something that medicine used to do that medicine does not do anymore. So how do they revitalize and check on a baby nowadays?
Well, and with a child, especially long ago, they didn't really think the child felt any pain. Like children and animals, that maybe they didn't really have a full set of consciousness, and so it was believed they couldn't even feel pain. So then, spanking the child's bottom, no one really worried about that. Plus, spanking was pretty common, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think an aspect of that that does make sense, like that could be a good practice to give a spank startle to the child. They need to breathe, right? As soon as they're born, they need to take that first breath. It's pretty vital. I know in my family history, there's a lot of dairy farming, and if we were ever helping a calf to be delivered and the calf was now out and not breathing, we would take a piece of straw and put it up in the nostril and kind of tickle the calf's nose to get it to take that first big breath. And you don't want very much time to go by from the actual birth until it takes that first breath. So yeah, so the fundamental elements of it are very sound, but yeah, we don't think about inflicting pain, and we don't even have to do a spank anymore.
No, I
There's
think
other
nowadays
ways.
they typically
Yeah,
just do a
could do
rub,
some
like a
massage. We
rosy.
just need to stimulate some activity, and we definitely the idea of branding. I would say we're against that officially. But that's interesting. And we use a phrase like that, and we don't even always know where the source of it is. And even though our cultural values may have changed considerably to where we don't completely agree with the origins of that practice, we still use that in our everyday vernacular. And sometimes it's fascinating just to examine some of that.
Yeah, so we don't blow smoke up people's butts to save them from drowning anymore. And we don't beat our children right when they come into the world.
That's
Like
right.
that's
That's right.
two things we don't do
We want
anymore.
to do things differently, a little less harmfully. Okay, here's another story. Have you ever heard the phrase, someone might say, "Oh, that person's just a snake oil salesman"? Which, if we use that phrase, then we're thinking, oh, they're false, they're selling something with a promise that is not going to be delivered, it's not real. So snake oil salesman, there's an interesting history to that. So back when the railroads were being built and we were having the big transcontinental race, we've got one group from the east and the other group from the west, and they're going to meet on the western side. There were the recruitment. We had the recruitment of a lot of Chinese ancestry people, Chinese people coming in as immigrants to specifically work on the railroad. And that's got its own history that isn't always so positive. But my point here is that the Chinese, oftentimes, very few of them spoke English. And if they were ill, they would use their own set of medicine, their own Chinese medicine. And they might even have someone who's a doctor or a practitioner of Chinese medicine. So, what tend to happen is if you're working on the railroad, at the end of the day, long hours of physical labor, you're going to have sore muscles, sore joints. And so one of the Chinese treatments was the base of it comes from a water snake, a Chinese water snake, and it has a little bit of an element of poison in it. And over centuries, that medicine came into Chinese culture. And then, of course, it got brought over to the Americas. So here we are on the railroad out west, and now the whites are learning, what is this ointment? What is it? So they don't know all the secrets of what it's about. They just know something about a poisonous snake. So a fella decides, hey, I can do that too. We have poisonous snakes all over the place. We've got rattlesnakes. I'll go catch a rattlesnake and milk it and make my own concoction. And so that's exactly what happened. That became popularized at one of the world's fairs. And, all of a sudden now all the rage is that we have this tonic that has elements of poison rattlesnake in it. And probably alcohol and who knows what else. So this is in this formula that this person is selling that's going to cure everything. Now, always be leery when some new product comes on the market that's going to be the cure-all for everything. That'll sound great at the beginning, but in actuality, we'll learn more and more about it, and it'll only handle a few things or nothing, right? So in
Right.
this case, actually, some people were harmed and even killed because if one person does it and makes some money, of course other people are going to copy it and make their own formulas. And so we had just this proliferation of, the medicine wagon pulls into town and they're selling their special tonic and making money, and then quickly leaving town before the backlash hits. So anyway, the idea of a snake oil salesman, like that became the catchphrase of, be leery of someone who's selling you false goods, and they're selling you a treatment that actually doesn't work or might even harm you and make it worse.
Yeah, and I think that this is another like really interesting topic to touch on,
Yeah.
which is I think that there's a lot of things out there that people look at as being similar to snake oil. Like a lot of ancient remedies and modalities that were used for a very long time, people consider them, without effect. And I think that's really important to kind of hash out a little bit because there are a lot of things. Like, for example, I was on a TikTok live the other day
Okay.
and I was having this conversation with this young man, and I was telling him, well, you could use these herbs to help
Right.
this situation.
Right.
And he was basically saying, no, I want something that actually works. So in his
Right.
mind, he was thinking that pharmaceuticals were the only thing that actually
That was
worked.
valid, scientifically proven, and everything else is zero. It's
Right.
nothing, it's worthless.
Right. And that's a really false assumption.
Right.
There are lots of things provided by nature that have medicinal value. In fact, anything we put in our body has some level of medicinal effect, right? So if I
Absolutely.
eat pizza, just as an example, I'm getting the fats and the proteins, of
Right.
just the macros, right? Fats, proteins, carbohydrates. All of those things help my body function in different ways. So you could consider them
Sure.
a medicine. So I just want to throw this out there that yes, there are definitely definitive snake oil-like substances
Right.
that have no attributable effect that we're aware of on the human body. But I don't think you want to throw the baby out with the
No,
bathwater.
no way. And like I said, I consulted with a friend of mine who specializes in Chinese medicine.
Yeah, Jason Miller.
Jason, and
Jason's awesome, by the
he's like, yeah,
way.
I know what that is, and it's helpful for this and this. So it is a medicine, and if it is used properly, and if it's prepared properly, based on many years of good sound treatments, then great. It's when somebody takes a good idea and runs crazy with it and then tries to market it as something that it's not. That's when we should be careful. And
Yeah.
today we have, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and we may at sometimes be aggravated by that institution. However, the whole point of it is that we want to have safety. So then if you go to the store and you buy a bottle of snake oil, you want to make, it should do what it says it's going to do. And somebody
Right.
needs to be checking on that. So that's part of the idea of that we have in place today that maybe wasn't there in the past.
Yeah. And there's a lot of complexity with that too. So we just want to recognize
Yeah,
that. Like
totally.
there's a lot of money that goes into the world of medicine.
There is.
And because of that, sometimes therapies that are out there have a monetary gain that may be pushing that therapy over maybe a more effective therapy.
Right.
And so we recognize that, and we recognize that,
It's easy to overpromise,
right. Yeah.
because we all want positive results and somebody wants to make some money as well. So yeah, so quackery, more quackery stories. What do
Okay, so
you
yeah, so this I thought was really interesting. Now, this doesn't have a direct phrase
Okay,
with it, so it's not like snake oil salesman
right?
or brand spanking new or blowing smoke up their ass. This is a therapeutic option that was done for a short period of time during an early
Okay,
19th century.
okay,
And what was going on is there was the cholera epidemic,
all
and
right,
when people had cholera, they would lose a lot of fluids,
right,
right? And become very dehydrated. And it was just really a terrible disease to suffer
right,
from at that
right.
point in time. Nowadays, we have a lot, modern medicine has a lot of things they can bring in that
Sure.
can offset that loose stool that goes along with that. But it's still a dangerous disease. That being said, uh, there was a time where someone got the idea, and this is important. So I'll just bring this up
Okay,
because I think it's part of our whole thing here, which is even nowadays, we have things that we think are theoretically fantastic medicinal approaches
right.
that may down the road come to find out that what was that quackery? What were we doing? There are
Right.
so many better things we could consider. So let's just put that in perspective here.
We're learning
So
as we go.
they said, someone came along, physicians came along and said, milk is a very nutritious
Right.
thing. And not only is it nutritious, I mean, it's got proteins, it's got fats in it. I
Right.
mean, this could be a really good blood replacement, and a
Right.
real good nutritive that we could put directly into the bloodstream. So someone tested this on a cholera patient. I believe this was in Canada
Okay.
at the time, but physicians did this, gave an IV, and that person
Got better. Yeah,
got better
sure.
and recovered. And so that kind of propagated the use of the milk IV for a number of other patients. Unfortunately, that N of one didn't work out the same for a lot of other people. In fact, like a lot of people had anaphylactic reactions,
Right.
like
If a little's
really
good, a
bad
lot must be
responses.
better, right?
Right. So basically, milk was not a good blood replacement, which
No.
is what they were looking for at the time. And theoretically, I think it was an interesting idea. And it did actually help someone who
Well,
was probably really, really nutritionally low deficient.
well,
So,
I think too that some of the roots of that come from Greek medicine. There was a belief in the humors of the body needing to be balanced. There were like four main humors, and so like the idea of bloodletting is we got to balance out these four humors or fluids that are in the body. And so the classic example on the bloodletting is George Washington.
mhm.
Saw too many doctors with the same idea, and that depleted him instead of helping him to recover. But the idea of, well, the white bile, we need to increase that. So milk seems like a great white fluid. Let's put that in the blood system and try to restore those humors. And so we get some of that idea gets carried on and passed on from, one group in a medical training institution to another, to another, to another, and we just keep adding on to the learning that was already there. So then that seems to make sense. Why don't we, like you say, leap from logic A to B to C, and then we find out, whoa, C went totally in the wrong direction. Let's back up and fix that. So yeah, got milk. Great. Got milk. Milk can be a
Directly
good
into
thing, but directly in the veins, too much, too much.
So it's interesting because I think that a lot of these therapies hold truths within them too.
Right.
Like you were saying with the Greek origins in that regard. So, one of the great examples that I would give, and that with the milk kind of idea and thinking, is that, well, if you take it internally, it was very nutritive for people. Babies would rely on mother's milk. And so it makes sense. Like logically, you could see how they jump to that. And I
Right.
think you can see that with any of these like early theories that they were using, but ultimately that fell out of favor very quickly because
Yes.
they learned that people would not do so well when they were giving milk as an IV. But another interesting point that
Okay.
I'll make is the N of one, right? It
Yeah.
worked for one
So when you
person.
say N of one, okay, make
Yeah.
sure you explain that because
So
they may
N
not know.
just represents number. And so whenever you're doing a study, the larger the number of
Right.
participants in the study, the more likely that the effect is legitimate,
Yeah. More
right?
reliable
It's more
results.
reliable.
So
And
if you only have
so,
one person in the group and they get better, that study does not prove the sample size is too small,
right.
right? So
Yeah,
N of
that's
one,
what that would
when
mean.
you're saying N of one, you're saying that was a very poor study to base a new treatment plan on.
Right. And that's the thing about what we see often in medicine. And I think this is really important to bring up,
Okay.
that what works for one does not necessarily work for all. And what works for maybe 5%, right? Maybe
Right.
doesn't work for the other
Right.
95%. And so I think it's really important to recognize that aspect of things because a lot of what we do when we experience a positive result with something is we internalize that, then we share it. And, human beings are very communal.
Yes.
We want to share what
Right.
works for us. And so
Absolutely.
you see this happen throughout medicine very frequently where something catches on, that doesn't hold up in the studies as being anything greater than placebo effect. Yet there's this propagation because one or two people did really well with it, or a
Right.
small percentage. I see that a lot with cancer. I see that a lot
Right.
with cancer. And I bring this up, maybe going a little off topic, but I bring this up because it's a real concern that we don't follow the higher percentages and we don't follow the things that we know from large groups of people's experiences to be more effective. We have to be aware of that bias in our human nature and that we need to carefully consider the therapies that we put in. And the way you consider it is this simple. Is it harmful and does the good outweigh the risk, right? And so as long as there's not a high risk, then and you're not avoiding other therapies that could be providing benefit,
Yeah.
then why worry about it,
Well, I also think we should all consider, we want results of some new treatment to be proven, and we want there to be research-backed results. Now, the first thing I would say is that research never proves anything. Research points towards something that seems to be effective, but one study by itself does not prove anything. And so it supports a premise, but it does not necessarily prove it. But sometimes in our mind we hear that, oh, a research article said this, and then we say, oh, well, if research says it,
oh yeah.
it must be true. Well, you start digging into it, and maybe you find out that the study itself wasn't constructed very well. Like maybe there were only 20 people in the group
Right.
where maybe there should
Yeah.
have been 2,000. And maybe it was only done once where maybe it should have done many times. And maybe some of the elements that should have been controlled were not. And so there were multiple factors there. So oftentimes research is going to say, we did this experiment, we controlled what we thought we could, and here were these positive results, and it's statistically significant. Now, that's just like the weather forecast, right? If we say, well, there's 80% chance of rain, okay, in 10 different times that we've had identical circumstances, 8 out of 10 times it rained. Well, that also means 2 out of the 10 it did not rain.
Yeah.
So we can't just say, oh, 80% chance of rain. That means it's 100% chance of, no, it's not 100% chance. It's statistically significant. 80%, I'm bringing my umbrella, right? Because there's really, really good statistical percentage that that's going to happen. But I also know it might not. So I would just caution everyone too. It's important that things are backed by research, but there needs to be multiple studies done over multiple times and constructed slightly different and repeated many times,
Yeah.
showing the same results before we can say anything proves something else.
Yeah. And even when you have pretty definitive findings, it doesn't mean that something better can't come along. And then that has to be compared to the previous thing that was used to show it was more effective, right? And one of the things I'll say too that I think is really important, and this is an ethical quandary, and I just bring it up because I think it kind of
Right?
stimulates thought here, is and here's a great example. There was a young man that recently created an AI,
Okay.
like I think heart auscultation
Right. Right.
device. You heard about this?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah, and he had, I believe it was 96% efficacy of
Right.
diagnosing the heart condition that the person had based on this app listening to it. It was AI. So I think, wow, that is amazing, right? Compared to
That's
like
out of the ballpark.
human
Yeah.
like error and such. However, it brought this thought to my mind, and I just share this now. What about that other 4%? You know?
Right.
And I think that in medicine, even though it isn't feasible to think that we're going to get it right all of the time, which we never do, people are just too individually different. I think that it's important to recognize that when something doesn't work, that does work 96% of the time,
Right.
we have to be open to that other possible 4%, not just say, well, you fall into this category, sorry for you. We have to be open to basically saying, just because it works for the majority
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for everyone. And if it doesn't work for that one, how can we shift our perspective and be open minded enough to say, hey, this is effective 96% of the time, but this person falls in that 4% category. How can I support them?
It depends on how normal you are, right? My
Right.
wife also often tells me, "Can you just be normal?" And I say, "Honey, normal is just a setting on the wash machine." So we're all unique and different, and it's like a diet, for example. There's not one diet that works for everyone. And so the diet needs to be customized to the person, their type, their metabolism, their needs, their age, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so medicine is really good, and I like that we have a very scientific approach, and we made some giant leaps in that. But it's
Mhm.
also kind of fun to look at some of those times when we thought, Eureka, we solved something, and everyone gets excited about it, and then a few months later we find out, no, this actually wasn't what we thought.
So, what's another one that we want to hop into here?
Let's see some more. Oh, how about originally meth was developed by a Japanese chemist like 1890s. And one of
Methamphetamine.
the big
Yeah.
one of the big treatments was for obesity. And you know what? It works. Meth really works well for treating obesity. However, there's a big but to that, because we would all agree that meth is a pretty dangerous, toxic substance to be putting into your body, and it will lead to a whole host of negative repercussions that'll put you likely in a worse place than what you started with. So, like, that's another example where something came along that seemed great, but sometimes the cure is worse than the illness. And so we have to weigh that out too. So meth for obesity, for weight loss, like the ultimate weight loss drug, that's another kind of curious one.
Yeah, and I think that's important to recognize too. Is it still something that could be considered? I mean, there are derivatives that are still used even today in the weight loss industry.
Yes.
Of course, we have new, pretty incredible things that have come along, like the GLP-1
Right.
inhibitors, that have just been incredible in terms of their response with a lot less side effect concern, though they're still out there. But I want to point out that the problem wasn't necessarily an amphetamine deficiency, right? And
Right.
so, eventually that person's going to have to go off of that drug,
Right.
and that doesn't really fix the problem. So, is there a place where it's appropriate? I'll give you a example because
Okay.
I have prescriptive rights. I use them infrequently. I
Right.
try not to, but there's a place for pharmaceutical medicines, and
Right.
I don't want to knock them whatsoever. They're just not my typical first choice. As a naturopath, I like to utilize
Right.
natural therapies first and lifestyle changes before
Right.
I just
Right.
jump into, some sort of major pharmaceutical intervention. So I had a patient ask me one time if I would be willing to prescribe methamphetamine derivative for weight loss. And the person had significant hypertension, significant heart disease. And there was no way I was going to give a medicine that was going to put more stress on their heart,
Right. That'd be
knowing that,
reckless of you.
right, it would be reckless. So, point being is that not, we don't always understand like whether or not a medicine fits us on an individual level. And that's where going to an expert or, checking with multiple sources, seeing if this is the right fit for you and being open to it not being the right fit and looking into other things is a good option as well. But I still think there's a place for it in certain high levels of obesity without heart disease, and but it's not a long-term fix, and there's a lot of side effects that go with it. So yeah, it's definitely
Yeah.
not my go-to
So every
whatsoever.
plant, every medicine that we create, it has a purpose, it has a function, and we need to have wisdom to apply it to the right person at the right time in the right dosage.
Right.
And as we do that, then we do better.
Actually, that's perfect. So that's a perfect way to say it. So now this is our 12th episode.
Right?
This is officially our 12th
Okay,
episode.
number 12.
So this would look at a full season, right? If we're throwing
Right?
these out monthly, which we put them out every couple of
Every
weeks, and
couple of
then
weeks.
had some
Yeah.
technical difficulties for a while. But this would be, I think, the end of season one
Right.
officially. So that being the case, we're talking about possibly next season having other people come on and
Right.
talking with them. So hopefully you guys will stay tuned. We're going to have some really cool topics coming down the road, and we're going to have some really, I think, neat growth in our
Right.
podcast over time too.
And if you have topics that are of interest to you,
That
please make some comments. We'd love to hear about that. Also, if there's now, I don't know that I have a lot of famous medical contacts in my Rolodex, but if we were also considering maybe bringing in some guest speakers in different arenas to
Yeah,
have some dialogue with as well. If you've got some thoughts about that you want to explore, we're very open to your ideas and suggestions. Yeah, give us a like, give us a follow, give us a share. We appreciate it greatly.
awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye
We
bye.
appreciate you.